What would make a man worth $4.2 billion abandon everything he's ever built? His tech empire, his 7 mansions, his fleet of private jets, all gone in a matter of months. All because of a 20-minute conversation with a 12-year-old girl he met on a dusty road in Kenya. I'm talking about Jameson Blackwood, the former CEO of TechFlow Industries, whose name vanished from the Forbes billionaire list faster than his company's stock price crashed. This isn't just another rags to riches story flipped backwards. This is something far more extraordinary, a tale that challenges everything we think we know about success, wealth, and what truly matters in life. Before we begin, I need you to imagine something. Picture yourself owning everything money can buy, commanding the respect of world leaders, having the power to change markets with a single tweet. Now imagine throwing it all away for a stranger's child you met for less than half an hour. Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to Jameson Blackwood in the summer of 2019. Let me take you back to where it all began. Jameson Blackwood wasn't born into wealth. Growing up in Detroit during the economic collapse of the late 2000s, he watched his father's auto parts factory close down, taking their family's stability with it. That experience carved something deep into his psyche, a relentless hunger for financial security that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. By age 35, Jameson had built TechFlow Industries from a basement startup into a global powerhouse, specializing in data analytics and artificial intelligence. The company employed over 40,000 people across 6 continents. His personal wealth had grown to astronomical proportions, $4.2 billion, making him the 67th richest person in America. But here's what the financial magazines never reported. Jameson was miserable. Despite owning properties in Manhattan, Malibu, and Monaco, he rarely stayed in any of them for more than a few days. His relationships were transactional. His health was declining from stress. Sleep came only with prescription medication. He'd achieved everything he thought he wanted, yet felt emptier than when he started. Real quick, stats show that about 95% of viewers watching our videos aren't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and brings more stories like this to you and others who need them. Let's keep going. Have you ever felt like you were chasing something that kept moving further away the closer you got to it? That's exactly what success had become for Jameson, a finish line that kept relocating itself. In July 2019, TechFlow Industries was on the verge of securing a massive contract with the Kenyan government to modernize their national digital infrastructure. The deal was worth $800 million and would establish TechFlow's dominance in the African tech market. Jameson decided to personally oversee the final negotiations in Nairobi, a decision that would alter the trajectory of his entire existence. The trip was supposed to last 3 days. Jameson arrived in Kenya with his usual entourage, 2 assistants, a security detail, and enough technology to run a small corporation from anywhere in the world. He'd researched Kenya the way he researched everything, through spreadsheets and market analyses. To him, it was just another emerging market, another opportunity to expand his empire. The negotiations in Nairobi went smoothly. Too smoothly, in fact. By the second day, all contracts were signed, hands were shaken, and the deal was done. Jameson found himself with an unexpected free afternoon before his flight back to New York. Against his security team's advice, he decided to take a drive outside the city. He wanted to see the rural areas where TechFlow's infrastructure would eventually reach. What he didn't anticipate was how this decision would completely unravel everything he'd built. The convoy consisted of 3 black SUVs traveling along the highway toward Nakuru, about 90 miles northwest of Nairobi. The landscape was breathtaking rolling hills, acacia trees dotting the horizon, and a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth. For the first time in years, Jameson found himself looking out the window instead of at his phone. Then, about 60 miles into the journey, the lead vehicle began smoking. Within minutes, all 3 SUVs were pulled over on the side of a dusty road, their engines overheated and useless. The nearest town was 20 miles away. Cell phone service was spotty at best. They were stranded. While his security team worked frantically to contact backup vehicles, Jameson stepped out of the air-conditioned SUV into the African heat. The temperature was over 90 degrees, and the sun felt like it was pressing down on everything with physical weight. Dust coated his expensive Italian shoes within minutes. That's when he saw her. Walking along the roadside was a young girl, maybe 12 years old, carrying a yellow plastic container that was clearly too heavy for her small frame. She was maybe 5 feet tall, wearing a faded blue dress with patches sewn over holes. Her feet were bare. Her hair was covered with a colorful head wrap, and despite the obvious weight of her burden, she was humming softly to herself. Jameson had seen poverty before, in documentaries and charity fundraising videos and the statistics his company used to identify emerging markets, but he'd never stood 3 feet away from it. He'd never seen it smile, because that's what happened next. The girl noticed him standing there in his $1,000 suit, looking completely out of place, and she smiled. Not the practiced smile of someone seeking something, but a genuine, radiant smile of a child who found joy in the simple act of acknowledging another human being. "Jambo," she said, using the Swahili greeting. Her English was accented but clear. "You look very hot. Are you okay?" Now, pause for a moment and think about this. Here's a billionaire stranded on a road he can't pronounce, being asked if he needs help by a child who's clearly walking miles in the heat to carry water. What would you do in that situation? How would you respond? Jameson was speechless. In his world, people approached him because they wanted something, a job, an investment, a favor. This child was offering help to a stranger who clearly had more resources than she'd ever seen in her life. "I'm fine," he managed to say. "Are you okay? That container looks heavy." She shifted the weight and laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "This is nothing. I carry 2 containers when my grandmother is sick. Today is an easy day." She introduced herself as Amara, which she explained meant grace in her language. She was walking 4 miles to collect water from a borehole, then 4 miles back to her village. She made this journey twice a day, every day, because her family's well had run dry 3 months ago. 8 miles for water? Jameson asked, genuinely shocked. "Sometimes more if the borehole is crowded," Amara replied matter-of-factly. "But it's good exercise, and I get to think about many things while I walk." What happened next is something Jameson would replay in his mind thousands of times over the following months. As they talked, Amara set down her water container and offered him a small piece of bread from a cloth bag she carried. It was obviously her lunch, probably her only meal until dinner, yet she was offering to share it with a stranger. "Thank you, but I'm not hungry," Jameson said, though he was actually starving. He hadn't eaten since breakfast. Amara studied his face with the kind of directness only children possess. "You have sad eyes," she said simply. "My grandmother says people with sad eyes are always hungry for something food cannot fix." Can you imagine? A 12-year-old girl walking 8 miles a day for water, telling a billionaire that he looks hungry for something food can't provide. The irony wasn't lost on Jameson. Here he was, a man who could buy anything in the world, being offered the most precious thing this child possessed, her daily bread. But what she said next changed everything. "Why are you so sad when you have so much?" Amara asked, gesturing at his clothes, his security team, the expensive vehicles. "In my village, we say that sadness comes from holding too tightly to things that don't love you back." Those words hit Jameson like a physical blow. Here was a child who owned nothing except the clothes on her back and a plastic water container, speaking wisdom that his Harvard MBA had never taught him. She was talking about letting go of things that don't love you back, while he'd spent 20 years accumulating exactly those things. They talked for maybe 15 more minutes before Jameson's backup vehicles arrived. Amara needed to continue her journey to the borehole before dark. As she prepared to leave, Jameson pulled out his wallet and offered her $100 bill, more money than her family probably saw in 6 months. She looked at the money, then back at his face, and gently pushed his hand away. "Money is not what you need to give," she said with that same radiant smile. "And money is not what I need to receive. But thank you for seeing me as a person worth talking to. Most people in cars like yours drive past without looking." She picked up her water container and continued down the dusty road, humming the same soft tune. Jameson stood there watching her until she disappeared around a bend, feeling like he'd just experienced something profound that he couldn't quite name. The flight back to New York was the longest 7 hours of Jameson's life. He couldn't stop thinking about Amara's words, about her generosity, about the peace in her eyes despite circumstances that would crush most adults. He kept replaying their conversation, analyzing it the way he analyzed business deals, trying to understand what had shaken him so deeply. Back in Manhattan, his penthouse apartment felt different. The artwork that had cost millions now seemed lifeless. The view of Central Park that once filled him with pride now felt like a barrier between him and the real world. He found himself standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows, thinking about a young girl walking miles in the African sun while he complained about the temperature in his climate-controlled office. Sleep became impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Amara's face, heard her grandmother's wisdom about sadness coming from holding too tightly to things that don't love you back. He began researching water scarcity in rural Kenya, learning that over 17 million people in the country lacked access to clean water. Children like Amara were missing school to walk hours each day for water that wasn't even guaranteed to be safe. What struck him most was the happiness he'd witnessed despite such hardship. Amara had been humming, smiling, offering to share her meager lunch with a stranger. Meanwhile, he lived in luxury and couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuine joy. At what point does success become a prison? That's a question I want you to consider as we continue this story, because that's exactly what Jameson began to realize about his own life. 3 weeks after returning from Kenya, Jameson made a decision that sent shockwaves through the business world. He called an emergency board meeting at Techflow Industries and announced his intention to step down as CEO. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what he planned to do with his wealth. The board members thought he was having a breakdown. His lawyers tried to have him declared mentally incompetent. The financial media speculated about insider trading investigations. But Jameson had never been more clear-headed in his life. Over the next 6 months, he systematically liquidated his empire. The Manhattan penthouse sold for $42 million. The Malibu estate went for $68 million. The Monaco property, the private jets, the art collection, the classic car collection, everything was sold. His stake in Techflow Industries was transferred to a trust that would fund his new foundation. When the dust settled, Jameson had kept exactly $50,000 for himself. Everything else, over $4 billion, was committed to bringing clean water to rural communities across Africa, starting with the region where he'd met Amar. The financial world was in shock. Forbes magazine ran a cover story titled "The Great Giveaway: When Billionaires Lose Their Minds." Business schools began studying his case as either the ultimate example of successful wealth distribution or the psychological breakdown of a brilliant entrepreneur. But Jameson didn't care about the headlines. In January 2020, he returned to Kenya, not in a convoy of black SUVs, but in a dusty pickup truck loaded with water well drilling equipment. He'd spent months learning everything he could about water systems, sustainable development, and community-based solutions. He'd assembled a team of engineers, hydrologists, and local experts. Most importantly, he'd reached out to village leaders in Amara's region to ensure that any help would be welcomed and sustainable. The reunion with Amara happened on a Tuesday morning in February. Jameson was working alongside his drilling team when he heard a familiar voice call out in Swahili. He turned around to see her walking toward the work site, no longer carrying a water container, because her village now had a functioning well just 200 meters from her home. She was taller than he remembered, but her smile was exactly the same. She ran up to him with the uninhibited joy of a child and hugged him tightly, not caring that he was covered in dust and mud from the drilling work. "You came back," she said simply. "My grandmother said you would." What do you think happened when these two met again? How do you imagine that conversation went? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what Amara told Jameson during that second meeting was perhaps even more profound than their first encounter. "I've been praying for you," she said as they sat together under an acacia tree during the work break. "Not praying for God to give you things, but praying for God to help you find what you were looking for on the inside." She told him that her grandmother, who was the village elder and considered very wise, had said something interesting after Amara described their first meeting. The grandmother had said that sometimes God sends teachers disguised as students, and students disguised as teachers, and that the person who learns the most is always the one who thinks they have the most to give. Jameson had gone to Africa thinking he would bring solutions to problems. Instead, a 12-year-old girl had diagnosed a problem he didn't even know he had: the emptiness that comes from building a life around accumulation rather than connection, achievement rather than meaning. Over the following year, Jameson's foundation installed over 200 water wells across rural Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. But more than that, he'd found something he'd never experienced in his billionaire days: a sense of purpose that filled him up instead of draining him. He now lives in a simple house in Nairobi, drives a 10-year-old Toyota pickup truck, and spends his days working directly with communities to solve their most pressing needs. His daily routine includes checking on well installations, meeting with village leaders, and teaching basic computer skills to children who will use technology to leapfrog their communities into better futures. The man who once commanded boardrooms now sits in circles under trees, listening to grandmothers share wisdom that wasn't taught in business school. The man who once measured success in quarterly earnings now measures it in children who can attend school instead of walking miles for water. But here's what I find most remarkable about this story. When asked about his transformation, Jameson always returns to that moment when Amara offered him half her lunch. He says that gesture taught him the difference between having resources and having wealth. Resources are what you accumulate. Wealth is what you share. In 2022, 3 years after their first meeting, Amara started secondary school, something that wouldn't have been possible when she was spending 8 hours a day collecting water. She wants to become a doctor and return to serve her community. Her education is funded by Jameson's foundation, but their relationship has evolved far beyond benefactor and recipient. She still calls him by the nickname she gave him during that first meeting, Bwana Huzuni, which means Mr. Sadness in Swahili, but she adds that his eyes aren't sad anymore. As I was researching this story, I kept asking myself, what is it about certain encounters that change us so completely? Why do some conversations echo in our minds for years, while others are forgotten before we reach the parking lot? I think the answer lies in recognition. Sometimes we meet people who show us exactly what we've been missing, even when we didn't know we were missing anything. Amara didn't try to teach Jameson anything. She simply lived her truth, finding joy in simplicity, offering generosity from scarcity, choosing connection over accumulation. The business world continues to analyze Jameson's decision through the lens of profit and loss, success and failure. But perhaps they're asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking why he gave away his fortune, maybe we should ask why it took a chance encounter with the 12-year-old girl for him to realize that he'd been pursuing the wrong kind of wealth his entire life. Today, Jameson's foundation has provided clean water access to over 300,000 people across East Africa. The organization operates on a community partnership model, training local technicians to maintain systems and involving village leaders in every decision. It's sustainable, effective, and growing. But when you ask Jameson about his greatest achievement, he doesn't mention the wells or the lives changed or the communities transformed. He talks about the morning when he woke up and realized he was looking forward to the day ahead, something he hadn't felt in over 2 decades of building his empire. He says the irony isn't lost on him that he had to lose everything to find what he was really looking for. The question he now asks other successful people is simple: are you building something that loves you back? I want to leave you with this thought. We live in a culture that equates net worth with self-worth, that measures success by accumulation rather than contribution. But what if the real measure of a life well lived isn't what we gather, but what we give? What if true wealth isn't about having more, but about needing less? Jameson Blackwood discovered that the answer to emptiness isn't addition, it's subtraction. Sometimes we need to lose everything we think we want to find everything we actually need. What would you do if you met your own version of Amara? What wisdom might she offer about the things you're holding too tightly? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you the way it moved me, there are dozens of similar stories of transformation, wisdom, and unexpected teachers waiting for you on this channel. Subscribe if you want to explore more tales of people who discovered that the greatest adventures happen not when we're trying to get somewhere, but when we're willing to be changed by where we are. The last thing Amara told Jameson during his most recent visit was this: "My grandmother says that some people spend their whole lives climbing the mountain, and other people spend their whole lives helping others climb the mountain. The second group always has more friends at the top. Which group do you want to be in?"